Welcome to Humanist Canada's webinar series. I'm Anna Popovich, Program Director with Humanist Canada, and I will be your host today. Housekeeping items first. You are attending in listen-only mode, so please take a moment to adjust your audio settings if you have not done so. At the bottom of the screen, you should see a hand tool. Please raise your hand if you can hear me. Okay, we have a couple of hands going up, and thank you. Today's webinar will be 60 minutes in length with time allotted for Q&A at the end. We will use the Q&A tool for questions, so if you have any questions along the way, you can type them up with the Q&A tool, and we'll deal with them along the way or at the end. Before I introduce our speaker, let me take a moment to set some context, especially for those of you who were unable to join us last week. In March of 2019, the government of Quebec Premier François Legault, founding leader of the center-right coalition Action Démocratique, passed an act respecting the laïcité of the state, also known as Bill 21. Bill 21 prohibits certain public servants in positions of authority, including judges, police officers, government lawyers, principals and vice principals, as well as elementary and high school teachers, from wearing religious symbols such as a hijab, crucifix, turban, or kippah while on the job. This contentious law has polarized public opinion. The supporters of Bill 21 claim that it fuels anti-religious sentiment, disproportionately affects Muslim women, and restricts the freedom of belief, and is therefore unconstitutional. The supporters of Bill 21 argue that it enforces the healthy separation of state and religion, prevents passive proselytism, and enhances gender equality by freeing women from the constraints of oppressive religions. Over the next couple of weeks, we will continue exploring this issue. And the title of today's talk is Understanding the Different Sides of the Tension. And this is part 2 in our 4-part series on Bill 21. Welcome everybody. And our presenter today is Dr. Jack Jedwab. Dr. Jedwab is President and CEO of the Association for Canadian Studies and Metropolis, Canada, which holds the largest gathering of immigration policymakers, researchers, and service providers. He was formerly executive director of the Quebec Region of the Canadian Jewish Congress, and Jack holds a Ph.D. in Quebec History from Concordia University. He has taught at the Université du Québec in Montreal and at McGill, and his courses have covered the history of immigration and ethnic minorities in Quebec, official language minorities in Canada, as well as public policy and sports. Thank you so much for joining us, Jack, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's nice to be here to share my observations and analysis with all of you on a nice snowy Sunday afternoon here in Montreal. I suspect the weather is not much different from wherever else the participants are. Anyway, to cut to the proverbial chase, I'm going to present a PowerPoint which summarizes a fair degree of the public opinion survey work that my organization has done in conjunction with various partners in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada that aims to provide more insight into some of the factors that are underlying the support for Bill 21. We've done actually at the Association for Canadian Studies quite detailed surveys for about a year now. And actually prior to that, we did some fairly detailed survey work on the precursors, if you like, to this particular legislation. For those of you who are not familiar with some of the history and background to the law, when the, well, for going back to the period around 2007, there was a controversy initially that broke out in Quebec around the presence of religion in the public sphere. I gathered that really morphed into something along the lines of a debate about what was described as accommodation for religious and cultural differences. And some of you may know that at the time, the Premier Jean Charest decided, in light of this controversy that had arisen, in part connected, for those of you who've read any of the Quebec media, at least as regards a catalyst for it, an issue involving some windows that were frosted on a Y to prevent ultra-Orthodox or very Orthodox members of the Jewish community from staring into the windows and watching women work out. So an agreement was reached. The Y agreed to frost its windows to support the concerns expressed by the members of that particular Orthodox Jewish segment. And that generated a big media controversy, and then a variety of other issues that seemed to be connected in some way to that particular matter were getting much media attention, as well as the media began to focus on those issues involving these, if you like, what were perceived as the border as regards accommodation of religious diversity, in particular for religious minorities. And at the time, the Premier, facing some electoral challenges, decided to establish a commission, the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, to look into reasonable accommodation of religious differences. And amongst the many observations and the detailed analysis arising from a year-long public hearings that were held across the province was this idea that there would be a restriction on persons wearing religious symbols in positions of authority. Mr. Charest didn't act on that recommendation after it was made, in large measure because he was worried about the extent to which such a measure might infringe on the Charter of Rights, the Quebec Charter of Rights, as well as the Canadian one. And so there was no significant movement on the matter until the Parti Québécois was elected, and it proposed something a little more sweeping as regards the issue of accommodation of religious difference, which was a broad measure preventing not only persons in positions of authority, however defined, from wearing religious symbols, but more widely, all public servants would be prohibited from wearing religious symbols. And that measure, which is a highly controversial one, did nonetheless have support from a relatively significant percentage of Quebecers, specifically French-speaking Quebecers. About 2/3 in the polling that we did supported that measure, and to a similar degree, as that represents the percentage of support for Bill 21, which stripped of some of the challenges that the Charter values faced, that seemed to be quite a bit disquieting for some segments of the Quebec population who were worried about the impact of the Charter of values on the Charter of Rights. And at the time, the government of the day, the Parti Québécois, argued that the prohibition of religious symbols for persons in public service was not a violation of Charter rights, but they had no judicial support for that observation, other than insisting that they had some internal opinions that supported that idea. But the government went ahead, it looked at the areas of the Charter values that might constitute infringements, and it introduced Bill 21, which did not apply to the entire civil service, but went back to the Bouchard-Taylor recommendation as regards making those prohibitions apply to persons that were defined as in positions of authority. Now, in this case, with respect to Bouchard-Taylor, that involved the police, judges, prison officials, but the particular bill that was put forward by this government, the Coalition Avenir Québec, extended that prohibition to public school teachers. And much of the controversy and the challenges before the various levels of court thus far, which have been the Quebec courts, right, the Court of Appeal and the Superior Court, have focused very much on the prohibition attached to public school teachers. So with that kind of brief background, let me go to the presentation in the PowerPoint to give you a bit of an idea of what the polling that we've done. And this is our most recent poll, which was done last May, after the, just around the time legislation was passed. It was passed in June, actually. But you'll find, as I said, what I think you'll see is the most detailed survey that's been done on the issue to this point. Our government actually has been quite sensitive to what these public opinion surveys say. Actually, I've driven their bill in large measure, at least in terms of saying that it has achieved a consensus by the public opinion polls, particularly the ones that they've commissioned, that continue to show about 2/3 of the Francophone population of Quebec support this particular legislation, right? So that's been their sort of, if you like, dominant line in insisting repeatedly that there's a consensus in support of this matter and this bill, and therefore it should not be obstructed. The consensus should not be obstructed by judicial opinions, right? So let's go to the support. So here's the level of support, and what we note in this slide, which is broken out by age. This is a question about judges, police officers, and prison guards should be allowed to wear religious signs. Now, again, the teachers aren't included in this, so we've separated out the issue of teachers from the issue of the prohibition attached to judges, police officers, and prison guards. There's also prohibition for crown attorneys, by the way, as well, but we didn't include that in this particular question. So what you see is that the net disagree, 63%, is in effect, as I said, about 2 in 3 Quebecers that support this particular legislation. But what you also see is a very stark difference across the age spectrum in terms of the degree of support for the bill, right? So that people 18 to 24, that cohort only, as it happens, are more likely to disagree, rather to agree that these 3 areas, the judges, police officers, and prison guards, should be allowed to wear religious symbols, should not be restricted, in other words. And 36% feel there should be such a restriction. In every other cohort, and particularly as we go towards the upper age cohorts, the support increases quite substantially for the restriction. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, to be fair, on the original presentation Anna made, right, she talked about briefly about the sort of 2 sides of the debate, if you like, the for and against, and briefly mentioned some of the justification on either side for either opposition or support for the legislation. But in addition to the argument about the separation of church and state, of course, is amongst the supporters of the legislation is the idea that this has a historic justification to it, that since the Quiet Revolution in the 1960s, when there was the beginnings of the separation of church and state in Quebec and then the post-Vatican II period, Quebec has sought something like this, right? And this is therefore in continuity with the something that historically the province has been favorable to. So some people would argue that the upper age cohorts are more, if you like, attached to that period, or more rooted or lived through that particular period. And the younger cohorts did not live through that period of the, if you like, a big break with the church, which was quite dominant in the social and cultural life of Quebec society. So some would argue that that is a partial explanation for why there's a big generational difference in terms of support or opposition to the bill. Moving on. Public school teachers, again, only a 4-point difference in terms of the extent to which there's support or opposition for this measure applying to public school teachers. Should public school teachers be allowed to wear religious signs? 49% of the 18 to 24 cohort agree. 33% of that cohort disagree. But in all the other age cohorts, and as you can see, the support continues to grow for the restriction as we get into the upper age cohorts, particularly in the baby boom group, right? You see the level of support for Bill 21, that is to say, the people who disagree that public schools should be allowed to wear religious signs is higher in that group. Most Quebecers do believe that the restrictions of religious signs violate the Charter of Rights, right? Do not believe that, right? So most Quebecers have been persuaded by the government and by the supportive segment of the media in the province, which is particularly tabloid media, the Journal de Montréal, for example, that these measures are not a violation. These restrictions are not a violation of the Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Right? So 45% disagree it's a violation. Again, that also seems to have a generational dimension to it. Younger people are more likely to feel it's a violation. As we get to the upper age cohorts, there's less likely the feeling that it's a violation of the Quebec Charter of Rights, particularly in the baby boom plus group. So next slide. If, however, Quebecers were persuaded or were told that it was a violation of the Charter of Rights, if such restrictions were deemed to violate the Quebec Charter of Rights, would you continue to support them? And what the survey results suggest is there would be a 20% drop in support for the measures were Quebecers to be told by the courts that it is indeed a violation of the Charter. Now, to be fair, we have seen two judgments thus far from the courts. The first one didn't really get into whether it was a violation or not of the Charter, but the more recent judgment did speak more to that issue, even though two of the three judges ruled not to suspend the legislation. Two of the three judges did indeed contend that it was a Charter violation. But regardless of that, one didn't feel that that it should go forward with a suspension. And so because of that, right now we're seeing continuation of the process going towards probably the Supreme Court of Canada, which will take some time. But the bottom line on this is that public opinion would shift were Quebecers persuaded that it was a violation of the Charter. That said, most Quebecers do not favor submitting Bill 21 to the courts to determine whether it violates the Charter, although 40% would favor doing so. Right? And again, particularly as we go into the upper age cohorts, there's more opposition to people not wanting this thing, more opposition to this thing being submitted to the courts for an opinion as to whether it is or is not a violation of the Charter. Next. The more you think it's a violation of the Charter, the more you want the law to be submitted to the courts. The less you feel it's a violation of the Charter, the less you want it to be submitted to the courts. So if you don't feel it's a violation of the Charter, in other words, right, then you don't want it submitted to the courts. Now, one would think that if you're not worried, if you're absolutely persuaded that it's not a violation of the Charter, then you should have no problem with it being submitted to the courts. But that isn't what the poll results suggest. The poll results suggest quite the opposite, right? The poll results suggesting that if you don't feel it's a violation of the Charter, you absolutely don't want it submitted to the courts. Now, on the one hand, you could think, hey, why should it be submitted to the courts? It's a waste of time to do so because it's not a violation of the Charter. But you know, I would think that view would be counterintuitive. My sense is that people who don't feel it's a violation of the Charter and support the bill are simply don't really think it's all that necessary to find out whether the courts consider it a violation or not. So here's just some general views, positive or negative views about religious symbols and both minority and majority religious symbols. The reason that we collected this information is because what you often hear is that Quebecers, in what is one of the more secular provinces on the continent, at least in terms of or irreligious, if you like, as opposed to secular, and you know we could define secular in multiple ways, but irreligious parts of the continent, whether the views we often hear about just a general reticence and some hostility towards organized religion is directed at all religions similarly, or whether there's sort of a partitioning or selective view of different faiths, with some garnering more negative sentiment and others garnering less such negative sentiment. And what you see in the polls, and this is one of 5 or 6 polls, is there isn't really that much hostility to Christian religious symbols in the province. So Quebecers don't have at least the majority do not have a negative view of crucifixes or crosses, right? Which we've actually described in the polling questions, because very often we're under the impression that there's a not necessarily strong knowledge about what a hijab is. People may not know the hijab, difference between a hijab, a niqab, a burqa, etc. So we actually went to the length in the poll of describing what the religious symbols were for purposes of clarity. And you could see some distinctions, both with respect to the religious symbols, where Christian symbols don't generate as much negativity or hostility, nor does Catholicism, nor do Catholics, as do persons identifying with minority religions, either the religion itself or the people that are identified with such faiths, right? So you can see, for example, that Catholics, as opposed to Catholicism, there's a 6-point difference in the level of negativity, or in this case, positivity, if you'd like, towards Catholics versus Catholicism. Protestants and Protestantism, a 9-point difference, similar for Muslims and Islam, and Jews and Judaism, a 13-point difference, with more positive views of Jews relative to the positive sentiment associated with Judaism as an organized religion. Next. So then when we do the correlations, right, between the negativity and towards religious symbols and support for Bill 21, we see that there's a very, very important gap in terms of support for Bill 21 and negative sentiment towards hijabs, right? So to explain this particular slide, if you look on the very right, you'll see the difference between supporters and opponents of Bill 21 as regards the extent to which they either are strongly agreeing or disagreeing with the bill based on whether they have a positive view of hijabs, right? So that 60-point difference basically means that those people who say, I'm a big supporter of people being allowed to wear, in this case, public school teachers being allowed to wear religious signs, those people have a positive view, net positive view of hijabs. The ones who strongly agree, that is to say, they're very supportive of the restrictions, are much more likely to have a negative view of hijabs, a 60-point difference. So what that basically, and Kippahs, it's a 45-point difference. So what it's suggesting is that support and opposition, et cetera, to this bill are far more determined by people's views around hijabs than they are around crucifixes, which only generate a 13-point difference across the spectrum of support or opposition to Bill 21. I'm sure there'll be questions about that, but I'll continue for another, 15 minutes so I can complete this, and then we'll have time for questions and clarification. Here's another slide, just again, trying to unpack what's driving the support for Bill 21, right? And again, as you see, Islam support, those who strongly agree and versus those who strongly disagree with the restrictions on public school teachers wearing religious signs, opinions of Islam, Muslims, Judaism, Jews are the 4 factors that seem to drive that support for the bill to a much greater degree than do the other 4 things that we've listed below, right? Protestants, Black persons, Catholics, Catholicism. The reason we put Black persons in the mix on this thing is that some people will argue that that this is not about discrimination or racism because Islam is not a race and Judaism is not a race. So as a control, we put that in. But, you know, I actually think that personally I'll answer questions directed. And I don't think that saying it's not racism in terms of support for Bill 21 is sort of isn't any justification for the bill in terms of negative sentiment towards Islam. So I'm sort of not of the view that you could say, look, I'm not a racist. I don't have any hostile feeling towards people. I just don't like Muslims or Islam. I'm not one who seems to sort of think that that argument is a credible argument or justification or if you like a sufficient defense for those who feel that they're being criticized in terms of their motivation for support of the legislation. Majority of Quebecers agree the Catholic Church played an important role in protecting French language and culture. So I think that's interesting because you hear historically, you know, that very often this type of bill has been driven by people's sense of historic grievance, given the treatment of French Catholics in particular at the hands of a dominant church in the 60s and during what was called the Quiet Revolution, when the break between Quebec and its clerical institutions became quite significant. But you don't see nonetheless the hostility attached to the Catholic Church that you, at least in terms of what public opinion generates when either symbols of the church or perceptions or questions about the historic role of the church are presented in a public opinion survey. And I don't know personally from having taught at some of our institutions of higher learning in Quebec that the younger generation makes the same connections as regards the historic negative role of the church in Quebec life. Having said that, as I said previously, there's a certain irreligious behavioral side of engagement in Quebec's social and cultural life. You've got the lowest percentage of people getting married in churches, a high percentage of people living common law, higher than almost anywhere in North America, lower degrees, disproportionately lower degrees of charitable giving, which is connected in part to the church not being a major driver of donations. So there isn't that real connection, I would argue, to the churches in Quebec in any significant way. But there is a cultural dimension, I think, still to, or at least described as a cultural dimension to Quebecers' relationship with Catholic symbols, right? If you sort of drive anywhere in the province, you'll see all of our, many of our streets are named after saints. My favorite is Saint Jack, right? But, but that said, there are still a lot of religious symbols. There's a big cross on the biggest sort of hill in Quebec and so forth. So anyway, we're moving on. 1 in 3 Quebecers believe that Islam and Muslims seek to convert others to their faith. So this is just a test of whether people feel that certain religions are proselytizing or not proselytizing, because some of you may be aware that one of the principal justifications given for the legislation is that persons wearing religious symbols are, by definition, sending a message to others, right? And underlying that is the concern that there's a proselytizing dimension to the presence of persons wearing religious symbols in these public institutions, that these individuals are invariably going to act, whether they're police, judges, teachers, or prison officials, on the basis of what their faith dictates. By definition, they will be doing that, and hence, that's why such legislation is justified, because they can't behave or offer an opinion or intervene in a neutral way, right? So the objective of the legislation is to create this religious neutrality, right? So we wanted to tap into that view as well. So civil servants that wear religious signs in the public service are imposing their values on me, right? Because that is, again, one of the ideas that's been driving some of the legislation, that people wearing religious signs, and disproportionately so people who are members of religious minorities, are imposing their values on us, right? But that view actually is not a view held by the majority of Quebecers, even though it's a view that you often hear in justification of this particular legislation. Right. Public school teachers who wear religious symbols are trying to convince you to join their religion. Well, 25% of Quebecers feel that that's the case, 1 in 4. Actually, just to go back in the previous one, 1 in 3 people feel that civil servants are imposing their values on you when they wear religious symbols in the public service. And that view is held to a greater degree by people in the upper age cohorts. Now, to get back to this thing, public teachers who wear religious symbols are trying to convince you to join their religion, right? On that one, most people disagree, but still 1 in 4 do believe that that is the case. Opinion on extending the ban. Now, again, this question on extending the ban or widening the ban is not unimportant in to the extent that some people have argued that this legislation, which our government describes as a moderate piece of legislation relative to the previous one that the Parti Québécois had proposed with the Charter of Values, is also needed to curb those people who might want something more. In other words, it's described as a bit of a compromise between the Parti Québécois' more maximal restriction on the wearing of religious signs across the civil service and what this government describes as a liberals approach, which is basically not to do anything, right? It's to sort of keep the status quo. So they've tried to suggest this is a middle ground consensual approach that would basically stem this debate, right? The buck would stop presumably at this point with this legislation, right? Now elected officials, therefore we wanted to see if Quebecers would support going further. And what you see is elected officials at the federal, provincial, or municipal level should be allowed to wear religious signs. Actually, the majority of Quebecers disagree with that. 59% disagree that they should be allowed. Again, the youngest cohort's divided on that. The older cohorts, baby boom plus, are much more supportive of that idea. And in writing about this issue on a number of occasions in our media, I've noted the paradox of Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, who's, as we know, wears a turban, being potentially able to reach the Prime Minister's office, but not being allowed to teach at a public school in the province of Quebec. So I felt there was some appropriateness about asking this question in that, elected officials, one would think, in terms of their capacity to influence or impose values or act in a neutral way, should be not dissimilar from the public school teachers or others that are the object of this legislation. Next, over 4 in 10 Quebecers favor the ban of religious signs in the public space. So the government should prevent people from wearing visible religious symbols in public spaces. Even that actually yields quite a close outcome, 47 to 43%. Most people disagree with that, but a substantial percentage agree, and in fact, 65 plus would agree with that, which I can assure you is a very clear violation of the Charter of Rights. Living with diversity. Our way of life is threatened by the presence of immigrants from religious minorities. There's a bit of a division around that, 47 versus 45% in Quebec. Nearly half of Quebecers agree with that. Majority of Quebecers believe that hatred directed at religious minorities is on the rise. So, we've seen media reports before the adoption of legislation and since about incidents of hate or discrimination being directed at persons in religious minorities. Disproportionately, persons identifying with the Islamic faith have been the object of either verbal and mostly verbal, if you like, diatribe publicly directed towards them. And I think there's enough media reporting about that, but it doesn't have any impact on Quebecers' support or not for the legislation, and people aren't necessarily making a causal link between the debate about this legislation and the extent to which there's a rise in incidents directed at religious minorities, specifically more targeting the persons that are Muslims. But just to let you know that that's just another thing we thought was important to continue to monitor. So those people who if you've met someone, you ever spoken to someone who is a member of religious minority, either often or occasionally, then you're much less likely to support this legislation. So contact either often or occasionally with people who wear religious signs is likely to diminish support for these restrictions. But what I've also noticed in the polling and in some of the opportunity I've had to interact with people in television or radio exchanges and so forth, is that a lot of people are very locked into their views on this issue. So they'll say, I've never met someone who's a Muslim. I really like Bill 21. Are you interested in learning more about Islam or Judaism? No, not really. That seems to be the answer. So there's a real sense of being locked into one's view on this and thinking that this is a good piece of legislation that will achieve some form of social harmony. Again, the more you have contact with Muslims, either often or occasionally, the less likely you are to support this type of legislation. right? So I think it ends there. I just want to go back quickly to one more point before I take questions, which is about the issue of discrimination, right, that I mentioned earlier. I think one can successfully make the case, if they were to do a big social media study, that in the context of this debate, the extent to which negative sentiment, and I would argue that outright racist sentiment has been given more legitimacy in social media, at least by virtue of the bombarding of social media with comments about religious minorities, would suggest that this debate has not been the healthiest debate, at least in regards to, as I said, the extent to which people feel they can say things that previously they might have restrained themselves from doing so because they were persuaded that it was politically incorrect to do so. I happen to think that, this is a personal observation, that it's fine. I'm okay if these people feel it's politically incorrect to say these things, as opposed to feeling that it's fine to do so, and they don't want to have to submit to political correctness. They just want to express themselves freely in a prejudicial way. Although they wouldn't acknowledge when I do surveys that they feel any prejudice, because they absolutely feel that there's nothing wrong with saying these things. And as I said earlier, it's okay, and it's nothing racist about saying I don't harbor any such feelings. I just don't like these particular groups. Right? So I'll leave it at that. I think I'm at 4:37. So that would leave us 20 minutes, Anna, for questions.
Yep. Thank you very much, Jack, for this wonderful presentation and the amazing data that you've amassed, much needed and revealing in many senses, I think. So we are ready to take questions. So if folks have questions, please type them up in the Q&A box. That's on the right-hand side of your screens. And I guess I will start with just a question about the data that you've presented, Jack, that I need some more time to digest it thoroughly.
Sure,
but
a lot. I apologize for that. So
very, very interesting and counterintuitive, I guess, in some ways. So the question would be, would you say that, can we speak about one or two or a main motivation behind Bill 21?
What are the main motivations? Well, I don't think there's one single motivation behind Bill 21. And, I've heard from a lot of people who've said, look, I actually harbor no prejudice towards Muslims. And I really believe that there should be a separation of religion from the state and, from government institutions. And I genuinely believe these people. I've heard them on call-in shows that I've had, that I've been invited to participate in. And I've told them, I genuinely believe you. I don't question that that's your view and your motivation. But, the vast majority of people who do support this legislation are not motivated by that. They are motivated, according to poll after poll after poll, by negative sentiment towards either Muslims, in particular Muslims, or other religious minorities. And not that many people are motivated by a sense of negativity towards Christian religious symbols. If anything, those symbols, I would argue, are just collateral damage, right? In order to support an initiative that is principally driven, at least by the majority of its supporters, by negative sentiment towards these religious communities. Now, I don't pretend that our political leaders necessarily harbor such sentiment, right? And Mr. Legault, our premier, when there have been incidents, has been actually swift to denounce incidents directed at religious minorities. But I do believe that he surfs on the support that is underlying the bill, that is more about negative feeling towards these religions, right? That is disproportionately held outside the province and the regions. Now, I didn't get, by the way, into dividing the poll by French and non-French Quebecers, right? And when I do that, non-French Quebecers are in the majority opposed to the legislation, but a not insignificant minority of the non-French population, about 1/3, does support the legislation. And its motivation is very similar to the motivation of the French population. So I'm very into pushing back when I hear from either in my province or in the rest of Canada, people who are condemning Quebecers and French Quebecers in specific for harboring, negative sentiments towards religious minorities in support of the legislation, because I've done nationwide polling, and the 1/3 of people outside of Quebec who support this legislation do so for exactly the same reasons as the people in Quebec who support it, right? Now, again, a minority outside of Quebec, as is the case inside of Quebec, I genuinely believe them when they say that this is not about these any hostility towards these groups. It's really about a particular vision of the relationship between government and religious practice or belief. And in France, we do have a separation of religion from the state that some people subscribe to, that isn't necessarily for the population about negative sentiment towards religious minorities. It's part of a century-old tradition, right? I happen not to think it's a good model, right? In France, I think by and large to fail, but that's another debate. So, but anyway, I don't know if that answers your question. I just,
Yes.
that's just put a little more context into the issue.
Here's a question from Victor. How many people were surveyed?
Yeah, I just put the slide out right in front of you, right? Methodology. So it's 1,000 Quebecers were surveyed with a margin of error of 3.09, 19 times out of 20. So remember, this survey was done in Quebec, right? So 1,000's a standard. Usually national surveys have about 1,000. So it's not a survey of a couple hundred people. It's a léger marketing survey, which is a very credible public opinion firm, one of the most credible in the country, that was commissioned to do the survey.
The next question is, why did Quebec government not include healthcare providers such as nurses or physicians?
Actually, they did do that in the Charter Values, but the Jewish General Hospital said they were going to practice civil disobedience and were not going to obey the law in the event that doctors or nurses were targeted by the legislation. And so that particular announcement seemed to fly in the face of the government's insistence that this was going to create harmony and goodwill and the feeling of strong bonding between Quebecers across all communities. That yes, initially it looked divisive, but eventually everyone would get on side, which is what the current government's saying, by the way. They've said that this legislation will contribute to social harmony. And, they'll actually remind us about how the Charter of the French Language, Bill 101, which was the province's language legislation, also, when first adopted in 1977, ended up creating, a very divisive environment. But today, everyone has embraced it. I mean, that's not entirely the case, but, that has been the argument. But in the case of the idea of restricting health providers, when the Jewish General Hospital came out and said, we're not going to obey this thing, there's going to be civil disobedience, it threw the government for a bit of a loop, because it became very hard for the government to continue to make the case that this bill is yada yada, going to bring all of us together, kumbaya, we're all going to love each other. So that's why the government, I think, treaded carefully this one, not to go there, because they were worried the same thing would happen. And actually, I think there was some strong connection with a lot of Quebecers that if a doctor is wearing a kippah, are we going to disallow him to practice his profession in an area where we're so desperate to get, health practitioners, and watch some of these people leave the province, which they threatened to do as well in the event of this legislation being introduced, right? One less doctor in this province, or nurse is not a particularly good thing. And so I think there was some connection. Now, to be fair, in this law, there's a grandfather clause, which the PQ was hesitant to apply, right? So what they're saying here that is making some people feel better is that they won't fire anybody. They just won't, who is in an existing position wearing a religious symbol, right? They just won't hire anyone going forward after the adoption of the law in those sectors, right? Because that was one of the controversies in the election in Quebec around the Charter Values, the idea that they would fire someone. The Premier was having trouble answering that question, and it got answered by one of her candidates, which I think was a major setback when the candidate said, yes, we will be firing people who don't remove their religious symbols, right? That's not what the population seems to want, something more harmonious. And so even though so far this thing has not been harmonious, but there was some discomfort with that idea. And I think that also played into, the Charter values, the more maximal version of this restrictive bill not working out, right? In the way that this one, which is sort of trying to look at some of the errors that the previous government made and see where it can be fixed. It does run into a bit of a contradiction, although, right? Which is that if the real core issue is that people wearing religious symbols are imposing their values on us or are not able to act neutrally, right? Then the people currently in the system, right? Teachers in particular, right? Because there aren't many police, prison guards, or judges that are wearing religious symbols. In fact, there aren't any, right? So the legislation itself almost acts on a hypothesis when referring to those three areas. Where it really has some impact, and even then not extensive, we're not talking about a lot of teachers wearing religious symbols, is with the teachers group, right? But again, if the argument is that this is the grandfather clause, so to speak, then this whole idea that people currently in the system who are not, subject to legislation, right, are still present in schools, presumably they'll be, if we follow the logic of this, imposing their, so to speak, values on others by wearing hijabs or kippas or a cross around their neck, right? So there is that contradiction, which the Chief Justice, the 1 in 3 dissenting judges in the last case, actually made a point of.
Thank you for addressing that. Next question is from Daryl. Some say that this, I guess, Bill 21 started with Heroesville. Apologies if I'm not pronouncing this right. Can you comment?
Can you repeat that? Sorry, with a what?
With Heroesville.
Hérouville. Yes. No, I don't know that it started with Hérouville. I think it started before Hérouville, right? So Hérouville is a municipality, an outlying area of Quebec that said it was going to, whose mayor, city council, I apologize, said it was going to adopt a code of conduct, right, that would prevent such things as stoning and various other archaic practices that it purported to be concerned would eventually impact the city, that small town rather, outside of Trois-Rivières or Three Rivers, Quebec, had any Muslim happen to move to that town. Now, as it happens, there are no Muslims in that town or any other religious minorities. In fact, there are about, I don't know if you can count the number of immigrants in that town on more than 2 hands, right? So, or more than one. So that it seems kind of odd, but people in some of these towns who have no interaction with anyone, as my surveys demonstrate, that's identified as a religious minority, identifies with a religious minority, are most influenced by A, thought leaders, B, whatever media they're reading, and C, whatever images they're viewing on television or listening to elsewhere or picking up on the internet. So that's really where they're getting their information. And very often they're locked into those ideas, and there's no persuading them, at least not easily, to change their point of view around these matters. But Hérouville, that town, emerged after these catalysts that were more about the frosting of the windows at the Y and whatever, because after that occurred and the media visibility and attention that was directed towards those issues, that's when it gave, if you like, more license to a lot of people to come out with all kinds of hypothetical scenarios, concerns, fears, etc., about what the presence of persons of religious minorities in Canada might mean. And one of the polling questions about whether immigrants from religious minorities are a threat to our way of life, showing a very high percentage that believes that to be the case, I think provides some support for that view.
Okay. Apologies for my French language hiccup.
Yeah, no worry. Don't worry about it. I fixed it.
Are school principals, vice principals, and senior administrators excluded from Bill 21, from the reach of Bill 21?
No, not to my knowledge, no.
Okay, next question is from Michelle. Did you notice that the most vocal supporters of Bill 21 were actually from Muslim background? Did Jamila Ben Habib, Nadia El Mabrouk, and Kareem Akouche?
No, I don't believe they're the biggest supporters. I don't believe those people to be the biggest supporters. I've done polling inside the Muslim community, and more than 2/3 of people who identify as Muslims, about 75% are opposed to this legislation. Similar percentage in the Jewish community. Those people are getting more attention because they've been propped up by the government to try to persuade Quebecers that sort of these smarter Muslims, more thoughtful ones, are supporting this legislation, and their views are being, suppressed by the more religiously zealous members of the community. Their views are not being suppressed at all. They've been out on public forums, given lots of media attention to make their case. And some of them have made their case in ways that I find very source of real concern, right? So the Premier actually has repeated some of the arguments they've made. One of them from this pop-up organization, right? Because they create these pop-up organizations, some of these individuals. Pop-up meaning like it's an overnight organization. It's the sort of, they'll call it the Muslim Association of Educators of Quebec, right, which is a satellite organization for Jamila Ben Habib or colleagues of hers, right? And they've argued that, imagine that, and they made this case before the hearings at the Quebec Parliament. Imagine how would someone feel? How would it, and this is what Mr. Legault, our Premier, said in a meeting of members of the Jewish community, if you were a Jewish person, right, were with a kippah, were in front of a Muslim judge with a hijab, would you feel that you could get a religiously neutral opinion from that person? And inversely, they've also said to people in the Muslim community, based on what I hear from colleagues there, imagine if a judge were wearing a kippah, right, and a Jewish and a Muslim person wearing a hijab were at a hearing before that person, or a police officer, right? Well, actually, that stuff happens in Israel, for example. There are Muslims wearing hijabs, and there are Jewish people wearing kippahs in positions of authority, and they do interact with each other in various spaces. So, I don't know that would be something that, does anything other than trying to appeal to the prejudices that people regrettably are not immune to in these communities, as they're not immune to in the population at large. Right? I'm not worried personally, but this is a personal opinion, about what's on your head. I'm worried about what's in your head.
The next question is from John, and this is a dedicated question in the email, and a very common question that we've been receiving on our end. Bill 21 is challenging for humanists. On the one hand, Bill 21 seeks to eliminate religious symbolism from civic affairs, and this is a cause championed by humanists. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, many humanists embrace individual human rights, such as the freedom of expression, and these rights are compromised by Bill 21. So in that case, Bill 21 reveals a unique situation where these two positions can be in conflict with each other. Humanists need to develop and promote a distinctly humanist stance on this dilemma. How can this humanist perspective be articulated, if it can? And
well, look, if you're going to
say in the final analysis that the rights of individuals should take precedence.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to present it that way, by the way, I may as well join your group, because I would consider myself a humanist, right? Because I share those views, right? But I guess my issue is, my bottom line on this thing is, you'll have to demonstrate to me causally, like on my scientific side, right? However scientific that is or isn't, that people wearing religious symbols are in effect using their faith or making decisions that are compromising decisions on the basis of their faith. Until I see any evidence to that effect, I've got to lean towards my human rights side, right, of where this thing, is going to land insofar as my sentiment is concerned. But I can't speak for others because it's going to vary. But I need to see that. I need to see proof that someone wearing a hijab has taken a decision, right, that's not consistent with the values and the sort of traditions that we've developed across time via our charter, right, in order to subscribe to the view that the state is being compromised by the religious predilections of that individual, not the mere fact of them wearing a hijab or a kippah. That would not, or a cross, that would not cut it for me, if you understand. That's just not going to cut it for me. And until such time as, you know, it's proven otherwise, I'm going to, on my humanist side that I'm sort of sharing with you today, I'm going to opt on what our charter rights tell us. Because I'm concerned that if we are able to violate something, if this indeed does violate our charter rights, and I'm willing, if judges at the court level say it's not a violation of the charter, right, then I'll be respectful of that, right? That isn't what they're saying, and most people I've spoken to are not saying that, actually. And it's not because you've invoked an exceptions clause, which I didn't talk about, the notwithstanding clause in the bill, right? That does not make it less of a violation of the charter, right? I'm hearing from some people out there, which is erroneous and misleading. It's not a violation of the charter because we've invoked the notwithstanding clause. Yes, it is a violation. Well, it is. It's not invoking a notwithstanding clause. That's the equivalent of an emergency clause, right? That means that it's not a violation of the charter. So that's where I sort of come down on this issue in terms of what you've just described.
Okay, thank you. Maybe last question.
Sure.
Would be this. Quebec Premier François Legault has compared Bill 21 to the model of France, Germany, and Belgium. Sure. Mm-hmm. And I read in rebel.ca that Quebec nationalism is an extension of French nationalism. Can you make
Yeah, I don't think Quebec nationalism is an extension of French nationalism, actually. You know, this is actually very, very new to Quebec. And actually, even in France, you know, these measures are more recent measures, right? They're not measures that have existed in France since the, early 20th century adoption of, measures designed to formalize the separation of church and state, or, you know, post-French Revolution separate, if you like, at least philosophically, right? So no, I don't think that Quebec nationalism is an extension of French nationalism. Quebec nationalism has really been focused by and large on language, right? And the affirmation of the French language, right? Not so much about religion, actually. And if anything, the Quiet Revolution period, even though it moved the sort of levers of decision making away from the church and towards a more, bureaucratic state, it was not, I don't think that, it's true that this is in historic continuity with what the founders of the Quiet Revolution envisioned 50 years later. Anyone who reads the views of the architects of the Quiet Revolution would I don't think subscribe to the view that this particular form of nationalism is a microcosm or some sort, or connected in many ways to French nationalism. And in any event, as I said earlier, I think the French model is a fail. So I say that with a lot of respect for people in France, but I'm not for a model that which is of course a Republican view of things, that says that everyone in France is French, but nudge nudge wink wink except Muslims. That's just not my view of a successful model, and it's also not the only model that describes itself as separating church and state. The United States is also a country that describes itself as separating church from state, despite what appear to be contradictions in that regard. And never would the United States' Constitution allow this particular type of measure to be introduced.
Okay, we do have time for one more question from Victor. What are the current proportions of authority figures that wear religious symbols?
Well, currently the police, prison guards, and judges and crown attorneys, it's zero, right? Zero. Although apparently there was one Muslim young female who was interested in applying to the police, and that I gather is probably not going to happen within this legislation. But other than that, it was zero. As far as the teachers go, I don't have the number offhand. I suspect we're talking about more in the hundreds, not in the thousands, not in the tens either. But that would be my sense. So that's answering this to the best of my ability. But again, as far as the police, judges, and prison guards and crown attorneys, this legislation is about a hypothesis. But some people are describing it as an insurance policy against, a future in which, the individuals from these minority faiths, or for that matter, the majority faith, although, as I said, there aren't people really concerned about, Christian religious symbols. Some are, but it's not has not been expressed a major concern. It's an insurance policy against this occurring at some point in the future.
Oh, well, Jack, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you. And on behalf of today's webinar team, myself, Martin Frith, and our presenter, Dr. Jack Jedwab, thank you for joining all of us. And please stay tuned for further announcements about the next session on Bill 21. Thank you very much, and thank you for your time, Jack.
No problem. Bye-bye.